Hi there guys, my name is Devon Coetzee and I'm a biokineticist in the beautifully active suburb of Takai in South Africa. Our practice is called Beyond Performance and we often see runners, cyclists, lots of endurance athletes that either have injuries or want to use movement to prevent injuries. So I see clients daily where I'm often helping them learn how to move, overcome movement asymmetries, and just bring about global neuromuscular activation. So in these exercises that I'm about to show you, it's stuff that I know works, that is simple to do at home, and hopefully can help you become a better, more efficient runner and reduce your risk of injury. Strength training for runners is incredibly important because not only does it reduce your risk of injury by improving your biomechanics, but it also increases your performance by improving running efficiency. So when it comes to strength training, there's a few things you want to focus on. And in order to make it as functional as possible, I always relate it to three core concepts. So runners should always focus on A, having mobile hips. And mobility is an important concept because it differs from flexibility in it's the amount of range that you can use, not the amount of range that you have. So it has an element of strength built into it. So flexibility is the amount of movement that you have. So for example, if I look at my hip flexion, if I use my hands to assist my movement, that's the range I can go into. That's the amount of range that I have. But it's not the amount of range that I can use. If I do it actively, so not passively, if I try to lift my knee as high as possible, you can see it's not as high as when I did it through flexibility, but that's the amount of movement and range that I use. So this is my hip flexion mobility, whereas this is my hip flexion flexibility. And what we want to do as runners is improve mobility. Essentially, it's functional flexibility. So mobile hips is the first thing you always want to consider. The second thing is strong posterior chain. So that's your glutes, hamstrings, and calves. And these are the muscles, especially when running flat, that drive us forward and improve our efficiency and our biomechanics. And the last thing you always want to consider when doing strength training for runners is activating your cross-pattern movements. So your cross patterns are your fascial lines that run across the body, and in everything we do, we activate them. So when we walk, if your right arm swings forward, your left leg swings forward, and you cross pattern and vice versa. So by targeting all three of those concepts, you will essentially make your strength training more effective and more functional. A couple things you want to remember when strength training for running is that you never want to be symmetrical. So when we're running, we only ever on one leg at a time, and we're always cross-patterning, so opposite arm to the leg that's forward is going forward. So it's always an opposite rotation, always unilateral. So if you want to be functional in terms of strength training for running, you must always be asymmetrical. So always in your standing exercises, using one leg. You can use both legs if you're in your big power phases, so your double leg squats, but if you're talking about neuromuscular activation, where the real benefits come from, always utilize single leg. If you're on the mat, strengthen one side so you don't compensate with the other. Cross pattern all the time. So always keep it asymmetrical. This exercise is called happy hips, and it's a great way to mobilize and utilize the range within your hips. So you have your hands behind your head, so you have a nice stretch along the abdominal fascia. You have your feet wider than the mat, or wider than your hips, so you're in an element of internal rotation. And then you're just dropping knees down from side to side, keeping your shoulders pinned to the ground. And as you drop your knees down, you want to drive this top glute through. So you're activating this top hip, this top glute, to get a nice rotation through the spine, through the hips. And what you find is you're getting a nice internal rotation here, through this hip, and a nice fascial stretch through the front of the hip, down the side of the thigh, the front of the thigh. So you're just rocking side to side, nice dynamic movement, allowing good mobility through the hips. This is a great exercise to build strength into mobility, and it all works around the hips. So you're going to sit into a 90-90 position, so one knee in front of you, one knee on the side. Just sitting in this position, we have a good external rotation in this hip and an internal rotation in this hip. And what you're going to do now is you're going to drive your hips forward, so you're getting a nice glute activation here and a adductor stretch or mobility movement over there. And then you're controlling your movement down to a seated position. So driving through, leading with the hips, and slowly lowering yourself down. And this is important because it gets the strength element, but it also takes you into great internal external rotation through the hips. So it's a nice builder from happy hips. Here we have our single leg bridges, which is all about isolated posterior chain activation. So working through that glute. So you're lying flat, a nice long spine, so lengthening your spine along the mat, almost getting a nice posterior tilt in the pelvis. Heel down, toes up on the bent leg, other leg hovers straight. And then before you move, you're activating your right glute, and then driving the hips through and slowly down. So it's not a huge movement, but it's all working through that glute. So what you don't want to do is lift this leg up and allow that to drive the movement. You want to lead with your hips up towards the ceiling and down. So it's quite isolated, and it's a lot of thought patterning from your brain into the glutes, making sure you're not using your hamstring or your lower back too much. So it's just driving up, slowly down, and when you're up, you don't want any movement through the hips. You just want nice control, up, slowly down. One of the most underrated exercises is called Deadbugs, and it's great because it improves torso stability, but it also gets these cross-pattern movements going, which, if you remember, is one of the 3 key concepts of strength training for runners. So what you're going to do is you lie on your back, and this is where it gets important because you want to push your lower back into the mat, and in order to do that, 2 things happen. You activate your abdominals, and you get a slight posterior tilt in the hips, so you have a nice long back. You're going to go from a tabletop position, so 90 degrees, and hips and knees, arms up, and then opposite arm, opposite leg, you're lengthening away from you, and then switching sides. And what happens is, as you do this, your lower back wants to lift off the mat, but you need to work hard to keep it pressed into the mat. And you're just cross-patterning by using opposite arm, opposite leg. And again, you're really activating hard into the torso, into the abdominals, to make sure you get no movement through the torso. These are called your dead bugs. One of my favorite exercises to target hip stability and lateral core strength is side plank lifts. So you're lying on your side, propped up on your elbow, and you're not sinking into the shoulder. You've got your bottom lat really strong, really active. Your knees at 90 degrees, knees just in front of the hips. And from here, you're lifting your top leg and your hips together and slowly down. And what happens is, as you lift up, you feel this whole bottom line of your body tense and activate, but it's focused from the hips, which is the center of your kinetic chain. So you're working your lateral glute complex. And it's all about controlling both up and down. And this is an important exercise because the biggest risk factor for injury when it comes to running is this medial movement of the leg. And what we need to do is, instead of supporting ourselves from the ground up with orthotics and shoes, we need to start by strengthening the lateral hip. And that's what we're doing in the side plank lift exercise. So if we are moving in, a correction we can make is by strengthening the outside hip, we can correct that and we don't pronate, we don't have a Trendelenburg. So this is why I love this exercise, because it really targets on keeping good form, good biomechanics, and improves your efficiency of running because more movement is moving backwards and forwards and not in and out. So it's up and down. When we talk about cross-patterning, yes, it improves efficiency, but the way it does that is it controls rotation. So the stronger we are in our cross-patterning, the better we are at avoiding unwanted or excessive rotation. So just by activating the cross patterns, we take one step towards that. But another way to do it is to get strong in rotation so we can avoid rotation when we run. And this is a great exercise to mobilize the hips and strengthen the rotators. And it's called three-way mountain climbers. So you're starting in a high plank position, and from here you've got 3 movements. So knee goes out, back. Knee goes straight forward, back. Knee goes across to opposite elbow, and then you switch legs. So out, back, straight, back, across, back. And you're working really hard through the obliques, the abdominals, the hip flexors and the hips themselves to create excessive movement. And it's not about moving fast, it's about moving far. So for example, when your knee goes out, it goes far out. When it goes across, it goes far across. So just really activate the hips to create the movement. So these are your three-way mountain climbers. One of the most effective weapons you can have in your arsenal as a runner is the single leg deadlift, also known as the single leg Romanian deadlift. And what this does is it strengthens your posterior chain, it mobilizes the hips at its end ranges, it eccentrically lengthens the hamstrings, and it also brings in an element of cross-patterning. So it ticks all the boxes in terms of the concepts for strength training for runners. So this is what it looks like, and I'm going to do it without a weight first and then bring in the weight. So you're standing on one leg, a soft bend in your knee. So although it's a straight leg deadlift, you're not locked out, you have a soft bend. And this is the key, you have your weight shifted onto your heel. So you're not forward, it's a subtle shift onto the heel. And as you do that, you just feel the posterior chain, glutes and hamstrings switch on. From here, you have a nice neutral spine, and that stays like that the whole time. Your soft bend in your knees stays like that the whole time. And the only movement that's happening for this exercise comes from the hips. And you're imagining your hips sliding along a rail, forward and back. So if I'm standing on my right leg, I have my left arm down, and that comes into play when I use a weight. And I'm sliding my hips back, keeping a straight spine, so I'm not arched back and I'm not finding range through my back. Just to there, soft bend in my knee, hips are back, weight is on the heel. Now the key here is to activate the glutes and the hamstring to drive the hips forward. So that's all that happens. So from here, slide back, drive through. Two things you want to be concerned about: sending this left leg back to help with the hinge, because if it stays there, you get a bit of flexion in the spine, so you want to send it back. And the other thing is keeping those hips nice and level, so not opening. So from there, driving through. So with the weight, again, we're looking at cross patterning. So if I'm standing on my left leg, I have my weight. If I'm on my right leg, I have my weight in my left arm. So hinge, activate to drive through. Hinge, activate to drive through. And it's all coming from this posterior chain. Good, and remember, it's hip dominant, it's not lower back dominant, and it's not up and down, quad dominant. So you don't want to go down and up, you want to go backwards and forwards. So that's your single leg deadlift, incredibly powerful. One of the most common injury sites that I find in my practice in runners occurs at the knees. And that's because with our daily lifestyles, most runners or most people are anterior chain dominant or quad dominant, which means they use their quads primarily to do any movement, whether it's a squat or a hinge or walking or running, it's all going through the quads. And as a runner, we want to use our posterior chain more than our anterior chain. So it's the glutes, hamstrings, and calves that drive us forward when they are extended. So taking us there instead of driving us up. So we want to move away from quad dominant and into posterior chain dominance. And we know that one of the most functional movements as a runner we can do is a lunge. So lunging forward and back. Because it creates a nice movement pattern that replicates and exaggerates the movement of running. The problem with a lunge is that it's a very quad dominant. So if you are quad dominant, you're just amplifying that movement pattern. So what we want to do is we want to create that movement pattern but keep it running specific and loading the posterior chain. So we backward lunge, now we're getting glutes and hamstring to drive through. Keeping a nice upright torso, driving through. If you drop your torso like this, you go quad dominant. And it's really hard to get the glutes to fire from here. But from here, you cross pattern through. And what you want to do is you want to get the glute working from here, driving, leading with the hips. So this last movement of hip drive is very important. So upright torso, driving through. And we cross pattern with the arms. So right forward, left forward, and switching. These are called your runner's lunges. And it's a nice global movement to improve your mechanics. And what you want to focus on here, from this angle, is also keeping your knee from moving in and out. So there, driving straight through and back, not twisting in. These are your runner's lunges. Another big risk factor for injury when it comes to running is bad balance or poor proprioception. So the worse your balance is, the higher your risk of injury. So in order to prevent your risk of injury, you want to improve your balance. So this next exercise incorporates good proprioception training. The other thing is isometric strength. So with running, it's very dynamic. We're creating a lot of movement, but more importantly, we are preventing unwanted movement. And that's probably more important than creating movement, because you want to keep everything moving in the right direction without unwanted movement. And when we start to get fatigued, you see things start to rotate more, the knee starts to move in and out more, and that's because we are losing our ability to isometrically contract a muscle. And what isometric contraction is a muscle is working, but it's not lengthening or shortening. So it's working without movement. So this exercise is called a single leg woodchop, and it incorporates proprioception, so balance, and isometric strength, preventing unwanted movement. So you're balancing on one leg. From here, you're getting into a nice hinge. And then with straight arms, if I'm balancing on my right leg, soft bend in the knee, I'm going from my bottom right to top left. Bottom right to top left. And as I go away, my torso builds with pressure, so it's strengthening this whole torso area, but also my lateral hip is working really hard to prevent me from falling over in either direction. So there, bottom right, top left, keeping the balance, trying to prevent this knee from twisting in. So from the side, you're getting into a good hip hinge position, weight on the heel, this leg far out, bottom right to top left, bottom right to top left. And this is called single leg woodchop. In order to keep everything moving forward and backwards when we run, we need to be strong on the outsides of our bodies so we prevent this movement. So we're talking lateral glutes and obliques. And this exercise, called Curtsies, is a great way to utilize the lateral glute in good balance, but also bringing glute max, so we're looking at hip extension. So standing on one leg, keeping a straight spine, and remember, always hip dominant because we want strong mobile hips as runners. You're hinging from the hips, and you're hinging across and then driving through into a knee drive. Now watch the movements through my hips. As I drive across, that's just tapping my left leg, my leg at the back is tapping. All my weight's through this leg. This is where my hip has moved out to. Now, as I stand up, that's where it moves to. So we have this much movement happening through the lateral hip. And that's important because the stronger we get through that movement, which that's what it looks like in a closed chain, but in an open chain, that same muscle produces this. The stronger we get in that movement, the less likely or the better we are preventing this unwanted pronation, Trendelenburg medial knee deviation through our gait. So a curtsy is all about hinging, tapping behind and across, sending your hip up, and then activating this hip to go there, and then glute max to drive hips through. So from the side, it's there, hinging over, don't be afraid to drop the torso, and then hip drive into hip extension. Across, driving through. So this is your curtsy, good lateral hip strength. So those are 10 easy exercises for you to do at home that don't require much equipment, nothing more than a 4 to 5 kilogram dumbbell. And remember, when you're doing your strength training, form is always the most important thing. So always move right. And keep in mind the 3 concepts. So the first one is having mobile hips, which means strong hips. The second one is always keep it posterior chain dominant. So glutes and hamstrings. They are your key drivers when it comes to running. And finally, strengthen your cross patterns, your fascial lines that cross the center of the body. The more effective you become at using your cross patterns, the more efficient you become at running. So keep those 3 things in mind, and remember, take it easy, form over anything else.